And welcome everybody. Happy you could join me. And I am going to be discussing today the compass points of good governance, which for better or worse represent my experience of 40 boards and 7 chairs in publicly traded companies and many more when we go to private equity. I've tried to synthesize all that experience into some practical tools that I think you can put to work pretty quickly. So I'll get us started, but I do want you to know that if you email david@boardchair.ca of any questions anytime, we'll get back to you as soon as we can, both Quinn and I. So please make a note of that email, david@boardchair.ca. Okay. At sea, I don't know if any of you are sailors, but you go to sea in the old days before there was sort of celestial positioning, global positioning systems, you needed a compass to navigate, a sextant to find the sun's inclination at the horizon at noon, and a chronometer in order to be able to get the time right. With those 3 things, you could identify where you were, where you have been, and target yourself to where you want to go. It happens that I went on a 3,500-mile trip to New Zealand from Papua New Guinea, where I lived for 3 years, across the Tasman Sea, down the coast of Australia, offshore to New Zealand, around New Zealand, before coming to rest in the Bay of Islands in the northern island of New Zealand, 3,500 miles. And there's the vessel that I did it in, 3,500 miles in the Pacific, a 42-foot Choi Lee ketch built in Hong Kong, and was sailing in good times and bad. For those of you who are ocean sailors, you know that there is a challenge of staying alive when the weather gets pretty bad, and it can, and it did. However, this is my wife, Debbie, in the top right, and 4 kids on the day we got off the boat. So we all survived. Charlie on the right was 4 years old, and Deb by me up there was 6. Ken below me was 8, and Andrew below his mother was 10. So 4, 6, 8, and 10, sailing for almost a year at sea, and almost not coming to a happy ending at all a couple of times. So in the DEP program, when I was running it, somebody said to me, and I think you're right, so you sailed with your 4 kids, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Why would we trust your judgment on anything? It's a very good question. So I hope you forgive me. I've maybe matured in my decision-making since those days. So here are the 4 points of the compass.
David, before jumping in there, welcome the 20 folks that have joined us. I'm sure a couple more folks will trickle in. And just seeing the shadow in the background here, I know it's late. So speaking of the compass, where are you right now?
I'm in Germany on Lake Constance.
Just wanted to explain with the sort of the darkness behind you.
Maybe I could turn a light on. It's a good point here, Quinn. I don't know if I can or not. Hang on a second. Meanwhile, you can chat. All right. Here we go. Hopefully that is going to work.
So this is the second webinar that David is hosting today. The first one was AI Tsunami, which I'm sure many of you have seen or maybe even participated in. And David is on a biking trip right now through I think the Alps in Germany.
Right. Okay. How's that? That's better, right? A little bit light.
Okay. Looks good. Carry on.
Okay, so I have these 4 compass points, north, east, south, and west, as the keys to board effectiveness. I'm going to run through them pretty quickly and then deep dive into each of them. And hopefully out of this, you'll get some practical tips and tools for getting value from your board. So on the north side, it's the skills, like who's there? That's the hard stuff. Who is around the table as a director? And then there's a soft component of that. How do they get on together? How do they behave together, and how collectively are we going to make them gel so they work together? In the East, we have a problem with the agenda. Now, I regard this as a very significant investment decision, and I'll share with you how I used to do this. I've been chair of 7 publicly traded companies, so I've got a lot of experience in putting agendas together. On the South, board briefings. This is a colossal challenge. Very few boards are well briefed. And without that, it's almost impossible for a director to add value. So it's the hard bit, what is it you want me to know? And it's the soft bit, how do you present it yourself? And then structural, we have audit, HR, and comp and governance committees in most corporations, but do you need a risk committee? Should you have a technology committee today? A cybersecurity committee, a digital AI committee, stakeholders, ad hoc, advisory. I mean, there are a lot of structural things you can do to increase the potential that your board can add value to the ongoing trajectory of the corporation. So that's north, east, south, and west. In the center of all of that is the chair. My proposition is that the chair is essential to any board that's going to add value. They're involved in the skill set, who's around the table and how do they behave? I mean, that's critically important for the chair to manage. The chair and the CEO together combine to create the agenda. The chair probably ought to be somewhat of a police person in terms of the quality of the briefings going to the board. And the chair is obviously an important component of how the board is structured in terms of its other committees. So the chair is front and central. And without a great chair, I don't think it's really possible to be a value-added director. I have actually resigned from a Fortune 500 company's board because the chair of that board made it impossible for me and some of the others on that board to contribute effectively to the ongoing trajectory of that company. And the chair and the CEO have to have a very close relationship. That's not drinking buddy stuff, but it is a very open, transparent, I'm always there for you, can I help? And there's nothing we can't discuss together. If that doesn't work, there's not going to be enough trust across what I call the boardroom chasm, the board versus the management team. And therefore, the chair is critical. So that's the compass points, and the key to the compass is the chairperson of the board. Now, I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these components. On the skills side, most companies now have what they call a skills matrix. This is the one from CN. It talks about competencies, sales, financial, legal, strategy, and so on. It talks about gender, talks about age, and talks about tenure on the board at CN. So a number of interesting categories, and this is very common now for most boards to actually try to systematically discern what skill sets are around the boardroom table and what skill sets should we have around the boardroom table. A component here that came from the chair of Via Rail was the empty chair. So there are 10 directors and the chair. And at each meeting, you're making a number of decisions. An additional component of that should be an awareness of, if we had had somebody around this table with a skill set in, fill in the blank, would we have made a better decision? Think about it in terms of having an empty chair to be filled by somebody with a skill set that maybe is not represented around the boardroom table. And it's a great question for the chair to compile, because if the same personality, the same skill sets come up time and again, then clearly when you have an opportunity to either change the board or expand the board, you could consider that skill set. So I really love this idea of asking directors as part of their decision-making when they come to the board meeting, what other skill set might have given us a deeper understanding of this issue? I'm not talking about changing the outcome. I'm just saying, what would we have had around this boardroom table if? So that's the hard bit. Who is around the table? Soft, how do we get them up to speed? Well, first we got to get them induction. Now, CATSA, Crown Corporation, has a huge director orientation program. It's built over the years, a very complex business. And you run into them every time you go to the airport, I'm sure. This is Dirk Schlimm. He was the chief legal officer at Husky. He's now the chief legal officer at Geotab. He's written a book, Influencing Powerful People, the attention of decision makers to get what you need to succeed. And at Husky, where I was on the board, we began each new director's induction by saying, here are the ways in which we are going to act as a board. For example, we'll treat each other with respect. We expect everybody to contribute. We keep the main thing, and so on. But it's a formality that's really important because it allows the chair subsequently to say, you know, David, the first couple of meetings, I think that in fact you haven't been as constructive towards coming to good solutions as I might have hoped you would be. Or you took up too much airtime. Or I know you're skilled in this area. Why didn't you contribute? So it allows the chair to actually intervene between board meetings by having one-on-one discussions with individual directors. So having something like this as an induction component, let alone meeting the management, seeing the businesses, getting out in the field, is really important. Individual behavior. One of the things that I've used as sort of one of my induction methodologies is to find out who you are against these 5 different dimensions. What are your intellectual biases? Are you direct or indirect as a person? Are you egalitarian in terms of your approach to structure, or status driven? Task versus relationship? What is the most important thing to get done? Risk versus restraint, or consistency versus ad hoc? These 5 cultural biases were created in Denmark, actually, been treated around the world in over 100,000 different organizations by Henry Zinglerson. So they're pretty good indicators of how you approach things. This is David, right down the left. I'm fairly direct. I really believe that everybody has an equal chance to contribute, whatever their status. I'm task-oriented rather than relationship-oriented. I'm hugely risk-tolerant versus restraint. No, don't do that. Let's try it, I would say. And I'm consistent. So that's me, risk and restraint. Now, if you take those two, you put them on a map. This is a map of a family company, the next generation. And you'll see there's a fair amount of spread. So 3 of the family members tend to be pretty direct and in your face, where 2 others tend to be very indirect and seek to avoid confrontation on that top line. If you go down to risk, you find 2 of the 5 family next generation members really risk tolerant, and 3 of them really risk intolerant. So if you're running the meeting and you haven't heard from those who want the risk, you better call on them and say, hey, Kyle, what do you think about this? Because your brother and sisters don't think much of it, and so on. So it gives firstly, it gives the awareness around the boardroom table that there is diversity of bias. And that's a really important observation, because diversity can become an aggravation versus an asset unless it's understood. So I say to everybody, listen, understand where you come from, how you're likely to approach issues, and then you can be a better team member, and it allows the board chair to maybe manage the meetings better. This is a family endowment board from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. You'll see down the right-hand side the picture of one woman, and she's a university professor, very much confrontational avoidance. And down the left, a gentleman who's on the board of a publicly traded company, very much like I am on the left-hand side. So if you don't do this, here's the problem. If I divide a class I'm in with high-risk people on the left and high certainty on the right, and I ask the high-risk people, what do they think of the high certainty people? They're bureaucrats, they can never make their minds up. They never take decisions. It's like the terracotta warriors. They just never go anywhere. And I cross the stage and I ask the high certainty people what they think about the high-risk people. And the answer is they're cowboys, they're knee-jerk. They just go off at the first kind of thing. They never consider things any deeper. So it's a truism that we always view the other bias different from us in a pejorative sense. But we got to understand that diversity is always a source of strength. So understanding the team map, as I call it, and the cultural biases is an important, I think, beginning step for people to get used to in their conversations with their other colleagues. This is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. You are different from me, but because you are different, you do not diminish me, you enrich me. And that's the attitude we want to build into boards, that the diversity is an asset, not an aggravation. Oh my God, there goes David again. And Peter Drucker, our job in life is to make a positive difference, not to prove we're right. In other words, be aware of other people, how they come to their decisions, how they think. So, very important for the chair to understand that. And if you look across various nations, you'll find that cultures are hugely different. I've just isolated a few here, but you look at Canada is pretty much down the left, and China and the Philippines and the Eastern nations are pretty much down the right. So they're completely different. And this guy who worked with Henry Zinglerson to create these cultural bias tests said the single greatest cause of difficulties in international business is not a lack of technical expertise, hard work, or good intentions. It's a lack of people skills for relating successfully across style differences attributed to factors such as national culture, organizational culture, job function, and personality. So we got to know who our colleagues are around the boardroom table. And if we're getting into joint ventures, it's a big job. I ran Saudi Aramco's joint venture director programs for almost a decade. And we found that if you were at home, like this is on the green side over here, and control, so you own more than 50% and you're at home, it's a pretty easy job to be a director because you can just say, no, I'm sorry, we're going left, I'm not turning right. As you get into minority operations, you need to work harder on your diplomacy. You're going to have to persuade other people in your own culture of the necessity of where you feel the company should be going. And then once you get into the rest of the world, you've got to be aware. So if you're up in Showa Shell, you've got to be aware of the fact that as a Japanese publicly traded companies, the board meetings never deal with issues. Issues are always dealt with on the side, afterwards or before, in a very diplomatic way, because relationships are much more important than coming to decisions. So we spent, on a 4-day program, we spent 2 whole days in the cultural awareness side, where your location was a culture different than yours. And I don't think it's any different on any board. And as joint ventures are the most common form of business interaction today, it's likely that you might, in your board work, have to face these issues with a joint venture partner. So moving on, collectively, so that's individual behavior. Collectively, we got to pull together as a team. We're individual players, yes, but we're the Green Bay Packers or we're the Dallas Cowboys. We got to play together as a team. And who knows who around this table? We only meet 8 times a year. Clearly, we come from different parts of the universe. We've all had different careers. We're all professionals in some way, shape, or form, but who are we? Does anybody know the name of anybody else's pet, let alone wife, kids, number of grandkids? You really got to build something around that table that will help a board gel. Now, this man, Cialdini, started to work on the psychology of persuasion decades ago. And he says you go from likeness to likable. You go from individuals to a board gel. Why do Marines wear 70 pounds of gear and run in full boots along the beach for 20 miles? It's not because that's what they're being trained for to invade another nation. It's because they're sharing a common experience of adversity so that each Marine is much more likely following that to help his or her colleague. The same thing works for boards. The more we do together, the more we know each other and the more we will reach out to try to help each other and understand each other. So stuff as simple as a board dinner is incredibly important. Ed Clark and John Thompson, when Ed was the CEO and John was the chair of the TD Bank, they had a rotation of board dinners, four components. Firstly, Ed would be there with the entire board, and only Ed. And he would talk to each of them individually, separately, and at tables about what was on his mind and what he was worrying about and get their positioning and advice. Then the second one would be direct reports to Ed without Ed. And then the third one were direct reports to the direct reports without the direct reports or Ed. And the fourth one were high pots, just sort of kids coming along who should meet the board and get to know them, and the board should get to meet them. So they actually made quite a significant investment in getting to know the people around the management board table, as well as around the up-and-comers, through this gelling process of dinners. Tim Cook, gelling his Apple board, takes them annually to China to visit the manufacturing plants that make the iPhone, for example. So this is how he gels his board together. So that's the skill set. Not only who's there around the table, but the soft side of this, how we induct them, how they get to know what they're supposed to be doing, how they behave individually, and then collectively putting them together. Agenda. The agenda is a really significant investment decision. It determines how you're going to invest your time at the board, and it determines all of the management investment required to brief you at the board. And so as the chair, I used to invest at least twice as much time as any other director, and half of that time would be to go to the agenda, because I really thought of it as an investment decision, not kind of a casual, oh, what are we doing on Friday? Before the board meeting, at the start of the board meeting, and after the board meeting, I'd actually ask each individual director, what do you think about the agenda? Are we allocating, are we investing our time in the correct way? Ex ante, before. And then afterwards, I say, how did it go? One by one, not collectively. How do we think it went? How did you think it went, Sally? How did you think it went, Fred? What would you do differently to improve our ability to add value? So I invested a ton of my own time trying to ensure that the invested time of both the management teams and the board directors themselves were getting some potential to add value to the company. It's interesting that McKinsey wrote a book which was published, I think, about 2 years ago, The Mindsets and Practices of Excellent CEOs. They took 67 of the highest performing CEOs in the world. I assume they did a good job of selecting them. And they said, here are the 6 mindsets that separate the best from the rest. And look at this one here. The board. Firstly, they engage the board. That's their purpose. And they say to themselves, my job as the CEO is to help the board help me. Now think about that. That's not kind of common accepted wisdom. Help the directors help us, the C-suite. If you're thinking that way, then you got to be thinking about building an agenda that has a potential to add value to help the C-suite. And you got to be thinking about the briefing papers that we give. So, you know, when you think about the jobs of a board, the list goes on forever, but I have synthesized it into 3 time horizons: the past, the present, and the future. Past, we're looking in the rearview mirror, ensuring things like the accounts are accurate, we're reporting out to all stakeholders, we're making sure we're in compliance with all the oversight agencies. In the present, we're overseeing results, we're approving outside the boundaries, capital expenditures, hiring decisions that management can't make without us. And more recently, I've added to this, we have to understand the operating corporate culture. It's pretty clear that no director of Wells Fargo had any understanding of what was actually happening at the branches. I mean, there was 1,400 former employees suing the company for wrongful dismissal. Wrongful dismissal because the only way they could meet their targets was to break the law. No director ever knew that. No one discovered it. You got to get out of the boardroom. At the boardroom, you eat what you're fed. You got to get out into the field and meet the people who do the value-added work. And then looking to the future, the board is involved. Management's in charge of creating the draft strategy and risk mitigation. But the board is involved in discussing that with the management team and deeply involved in the talent pool. So it's where do we want to go when we grow up, and who's going to get us there? I synthesize those into 3 lines of sight: hindsight and oversight and foresight, but they're basically the 3 time horizons: hindsight, oversight, and foresight. The first 2 are basically the compliance and policing role of the board. The last 2 are strategy and talent. So I actually boil it down to 2. The boards basically have 2 functions: policing, making sure that they are doing things properly according to the law, the audit standards, the compliance relations we need to have, the reporting out to shareholders that the stock exchanges and securities commissions require us to have, and making sure that management isn't stealing. And then the value adding is us as experienced individuals trying to help the management team think through their business strategy. helping the CEO and the team do their job. So those are the two fundamental ways I think about it, policing and value adding. So I did a lot of work questioning people about how boards work. One thing to note is that I changed the word from spend to invest. It's not how did you spend your time as a director, how did you spend your time as a board? It's how did you invest your time? It's an investment decision. And by doing that, I hope you'll start thinking about a return on that investment. An expense is gone. An investment should show a return. So that simple word change is something to try to incorporate into your thinking. Well, we did the survey of 275 directors with the Canadian Coalition of Good Governance, and here's what we discovered. That they invested 70% of their time in today's business, that's oversight and hindsight, and 30% in terms of wondering about what they wanted to do when they grow up and who was going to get them there. I don't know what you think about that, but we then asked them a different question. How should you be investing your time? Not how did you? And what would you think the answer was? That's the way we are. And the way we ought to be is an inverse, that we ought to be spending twice as much time investing. Sorry, I used the wrong word. We ought to be investing twice as much time and worrying about where we're going and how we're going to get there and who's going to get us there than we do. So this is a very simple back of the envelope tool for you and your corporate secretary and your CEO and your chair to think about how you invested your time against those three categories: hindsight, oversight, and foresight. And to think about it in a positive assertion way. We can change this by changing the way we invest our time, and maybe we ought to. There's some evidence that companies that do that do better. This was Russ Reynolds. They defined a high-performing company. The gold lines there as companies that outperform the total return for shareholders for 2 or more years consecutively. So you'll see they invested a great deal of time on strategy, 10% more, M&A, another 7%, 6% on CEO succession. But look what they did not invest in. 11% on financial statement review versus an average of 28, 6% on compliance, and 3% on audit. So they cashiered a huge amount of the work that had to be done in order to police the company and make sure it was on track to zero. And I did that in a number of my boards. I said to the chair of the audit committee, listen, you get 5 minutes to report to the board. And he or she would say, what, David, only 5 minutes? And I said, yeah, I don't want the board to redo the expert work that you, the audit committee, do. And any director of mine who wants to learn more about the numbers can share with the audit committee the numbers. But when we come to the full board, we are not going to review that again. You've done the work. I'm going to assume it's done correctly. So this is a proof, in a way, that you can leave a lot of stuff at the committee level and not bring it into the board, and in doing so, change the time allocation of the director's investment agenda. And Mr. Drucker, time is the scarcest resource, and unless it is managed, nothing else can be managed. So agenda, managing the time is critical. And I would encourage you all to make sure that going into each meeting, you have an idea of what the agenda is focused on for that meeting. Okay. Last, on the south side here, the briefings are a huge challenge. I mean, it's an impossible job for most companies. I regard this as an information chasm, and I like a lot of visual metaphors. So this is the Grand Canyon. The board's on one side invests, I don't know, plus or minus 260 hours a year. The management team, probably 3,000 or more per person. So the board's investing per person 8% of the management team's time. We as directors on the right are experienced, proven executives. So we've got good business judgment, but we probably know nothing or not a lot about the business we're on the board of. So in that sense, we're gifted amateurs. Whereas a lot of our C-suite will have been in their business almost all their lives. So they really know this down to the fine details. And finally, I'm on this board, but I'm also on 2 or 3 other boards. I have my own assets to look after. I have my grandchildren that I love. I have the activities I like to do. I have a very full book of ways in which I could spend my day, let alone my weekend. Whereas I'm hoping the management team is singularly focused on the company. You add those 3 components up, the time investment, the fact that we're gifted amateurs, and that we're otherwise engaged means that we have a huge chasm to span between the board and the management team in terms of making us effectively able to add value to the company. They know everything, they know nothing would be the operative assumption. So the information has to go across so that the insight can come back. Sadly, that does not happen very frequently. So helping the directors help the business is a really important aspiration that needs a lot of action in order to fulfill. I've got basic briefing rules of the board that I use in every board. I tell my executives, smile. When you smile, we all smile. It makes a big difference to your presentation. And give the directors space. Don't be afraid of gaps. If David says, well, wait a minute, George, did you think about this? You might well say, instead of being defensive, yes, Mr. Chair, but maybe not enough. What were you thinking of? Use an opportunity like that, a gap, to facilitate a discussion and get the board working on the issue. That just does not happen very often. So too bad. But I think it's the job of the chair and the board to try to make sure this gets improved better and better and better. And I also say, hey, you're not trying to give a lecture, you're trying to generate a discussion on the issue. Thank you very much. Otherwise, you go down the rabbit hole. The board's unhappy with the information. The management team thinks we're not giving them enough. They give them more. It ends up being a telephone book. One of the crown corporations I was recently working with, the average number of board pages that came to them every board meeting, 1,700. Like, that's impossible. But that was the fact. So you can go down a rabbit hole of information overload really quickly and useless information. Now that's the South. And then structurally, one of the things that I've been pushing now is that I think having a digital technology or a generative AI or an AI subcommittee of the board is not a bad idea, because it allows you to add skill sets that are really not fiduciary skill sets, and to build a capability of the board to dig a deeper hole and understand in more depth some of these issues. So that's it. Those are the ways they go. And great boards, as I said at the beginning, need great chairs. This is Ben Zander. He was the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic. He's magical on stage. So if you get a chance, it's 18 minutes. It's a TED Talk from 2008. It's called The Transformative Power of Classical Music. It covers a lot of different points. But at about minute 13, he said, I think he said 50, turned 50. And it suddenly came to me. He said, suddenly, I just realized that I was the only person on the stage that didn't make a sound. I had 130 gifted people in front of me. And my job was to pull them all together into a coherent whole and push out the music. I didn't make a sound. And I thought, that is a perfect metaphor for the chair of the board. The chair's job is to pull together all the talent that's around that table, both on the management side and on the director's side, in order to try to create a better future for the company. So that's a question of who's on the board, the talent, the tone, how we get along together, and the time we invest, the stuff we've already talked about. In terms of the tone, a little bit of detail here. That's a trade-off between trust across this management chasm, but tension. We have a different job as a board than you do as a management team. So there's a bit of a trade-off here. And I call that trade-off the tone. And it's something that the chair has to be really, really aware of and build and work at. And it happens that in sailing, to go back to my earlier metaphor, when you're sailing into the wind, rig full, you're at maximum tension and you're also doing maximum speed. So it's possible that trust and tension can have a common purpose, even though it's a harder thing to do. So talent, tone, and time, the role of the chair, orchestrating the board, bringing us to a position where we can add value to the ongoing trajectory of the company. And So this is a summary of the tools that I've given you so far. The skills matrix, the notion of the empty chair to keep an inventory of what skill set might we add, the team building, the gel, the 3 lines of sight, giving to the time allocation and the investment decision, and finally having this bias that successful CEOs really try to bring their board into their decision-making to help improve it. So those are the summary of the skills. That's a value-added board. Thank you, Donka. And that's the end. And Quinn, if they send an email to david@boardchair.ca, they'll get both of us, right?
Absolutely. If there are any questions right now to wrap up, please go ahead. And feel free to add your name. For some reason, it's showing as the person who set up the webinar here.
Okay. No queries, questions, quibbles? This is available and will be sent to everybody, will it not, Quinn, as a PDF file or some kind of a, yeah.
I did have one question. If you are
Yeah.
forming a new board, what are the initial steps that you take in order to not inundate the board with all of the say documentation and requirements that you are, is everything that you are presenting today something that should be out of the box for an immediate board launch, essentially?
Well, nobody goes wholesale into these things. If you're in the private equity business, you've been building a board internally probably for the time you've been in business. So going public adds more formality to it, adds more administrative responsibilities to it in terms of reporting relationships that are required externally. It adds a lot of work. But not many companies go from having no board at all to having a board, period. And it should be a gradual, in my view, it should be a gradual kind of evolution of one form of oversight and governance to another. It's more formal, and it's going to perhaps build more conflict between the management team and the directors. That chasm goes a lot wider when you go formally public.
Got it. If there are any more questions, feel free to add them to the chat here. See Adrian here, but oh, we got one in here. What's the comparison between boards and advisory boards? What would you compare with the role of an advisory board for a startup, David?
I mean, it's a good way to start. Getting a management team, an owner, founder, entrepreneur, getting used to somebody with an outside opinion. And many of them, many advisory boards don't survive simply because I thought it was a good idea to set it up and it pisses me off. They're asking all these questions of me. I'm the guy who started the company. I'm the guy who runs the company. I'm the guy who knows the company, the competition, the product lines. You know, what the hell do you people know? So there's a lot of adversarial potential in going to an advisory board. But if you're intending to go public, it's a necessary step. The management team has to get used to being responsible to something other than the great dominant figure. And so I've always been of the view that taking a public company into the public domain really requires a prelude called an advisory board to get the management team and certainly this founder, CEO, entrepreneur into the thinking lane of understanding there are other responsibilities if you go the public route, and they're profound, and you can't avoid them.
There's some really good materials on David's website about the introduction to board work, and one of the first video sessions is about setting up an advisory board and how that essentially trains the management for establishing this governance accountability structure.
Yeah.
The next question, David, how is AI challenging or enhancing the role of board?
Well, we just send the last hour. Fundamental challenge of survival. Quinn and I just spent an hour talking talking about that with a couple of other people. So we got a whole series on it, don't we, called The Digital Tsunami? And can you send that questioner the website for all of those? We've done 7 now.
Absolutely. I have a bit of a commercial here at the end.
Okay.
What would you say about, I think the answer is about fluency, correct? So the board and the digital tsunami really creates a challenge around the fluency of directors in having a handle on their technological acumen.
Well, I mean, I think it's an existential threat. If you don't get the board and the individual directors and the management team involved in this transformative enterprise called AI, machine learning, a generative AI, you're going to die. It's very simple. You're not going to survive. Others are going to be there and they're going to overwhelm you. And this stuff is improving at a rate of about 100% every 3.5 months. So a tool that you have today that may be a nascent tool, in 3.5 months, somebody else is going to have doubled its capacity. You just got to get started. There's no second way to do it. You have to build some sort of guardrails, we call them, to prevent some hallucinations and other privacy issues. That can now be done pretty quickly by external third-party advisors. You just got to get started, period, full stop, the end, and you've got to watch our videos and you got to get on ChatGPT 4.0 now, as soon as you hang up. If you don't know how ChatGPT works, basically you're done. You're finished. You're not going to be effective as a board director anywhere, in anything. So get going.
What would you do in a situation when the board isn't working well together and or when they are divided on an important strategy decision, David?
I'd do a couple of things. I'd find out if that was my opinion, if there were any other directors who shared the opinion, to kind of build a sort of a network. And then I and those other directors would meet with the chair. The chair is the person responsible for these kinds of bifurcations if they occur, and for remediating them if they do occur. And as I said, I actually left the board of a Fortune 500 company in the United States because I could not get the chair of the board to remediate the way in which he, as it happens, was running the board meetings. So I quit. And I think that's really your only alternative. You build a coalition of like interests, and then talk to the chair and see if the chair is agreeing with you that, yeah, we have a problem with this strategy, or we're not working well together, or I think that X, Y, and Z are. The culture of the board is a subject matter that should be broached with the chair of the board, because it's that tonality thing I talked about as a conductor. You've got to trade off the tension of being a bit of a policeman as a director. It's a different job than being a manager, versus being a value-added expert from all my experience in business. If the chair is not willing to take that on, I would consider you would be better off adding value to another place, not the one you're at.
And it seems like it's a bit of an art to understand whether to invest in making the change or turning around and realizing it's futile.
Well, they're tough jobs. Chairman of a board, if you have a bifurcated board with people of different opinions, I mean, it's a really hard job. But you've got to work at it. And that means building relationships with others and over time building trust, saying, Quinn, it's not that I disagree with how you proceed at the board. It's just that I don't think you listen closely enough to other perspectives. And I really would love it if you would do that. And if you have a problem with the decisions, please come back and see me again. I mean, I'm the one that has to manage the interchanges across the table. So I'm the one responsible. So come back and see me if you're still unhappy.
Next question. What is your opinion of boards meeting virtually or in person, especially when the directors are located in different countries?
I think it's a disaster to have nothing but virtual meetings. You never know who the other people are. You never know whether they're listening. As a professor at the Rotman School of Management, we taught the Director's Education Program 2 years in a virtual setting. I think we probably delivered 60% of the content value and perhaps 2% of the network value of being in that program. And I always advise people, wait until you can meet with and be part of another human interaction. We're social beings. That's how we get along. And virtual stuff works fine. You and I and the people on this program, we were able to contribute something, I hope, to their understanding. But in terms of actually working as a board, that gel piece, it's never going to happen if you're virtual, especially if you're virtual across national cultural boundaries. I mean, there's just such a huge difference between how a Japanese director regards his or her perspectives on issues at the board meeting versus a North American one. They're just completely different worlds. So you can only do it in person.
Going to skip a good one because this one follows on from the question we just asked. So virtual, in-person, or hybrid general meetings, are AGMs a thing of the past when voting is electronic and there is so much more access to company management?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, AGMs, well, they were always a formality anyhow. I think now there's such an invasion of boardrooms by different perspectives, people with different axes to carry, different points of view, different perspectives, voting for directors against certain timetables for their actions. It's a wide open arena now for social media and social interaction. So in many ways, I think the AGM, which was always, in my view, just a formality, unless there was a proxy fight, is becoming even more of a formality, especially if it's only virtual.
A really valuable short 30-second clip that you generally provide is around Mont Saint Michel and the need for directors to be prepared. Can you add that to this question?
Sorry, Quinn, I didn't really get.
Sorry, the idea that the public has invaded the boardroom, and
Yeah.
so there's a new change in order to have directors be able to act immediately.
No, I don't think that's true. I think that you've got a lot more different perspectives at a board meeting. Boards used to, in my view, sort of meet on an island, fortified in a fortified fort, separated from the mainland. And they did whatever they did. They were sort of an elite nobility that did what they did and did what they had to do legally to oversee the company, and nothing they ever did was ever public. Now, sometimes you got to know through a merger, an acquisition, or a lousy investment that somebody made a bad decision, but they were completely isolated and independent. Today, virtually anything gets into the public domain, goes bananas, hits the boardroom table. The case we use at the Director's Education Program is Centerplate, where the CEO, Des Haig, had doubled sales in the last 5 years. And then a video appeared of him kicking and shoving a dog in a Vancouver apartment building. Video went viral. People started to complain. Folks who were their customers started to boycott their own services. And in 3 weeks, the board had to fire the guy. So a complete invasion of a fundamental decision of the board, the hiring and firing of the CEO, was completely altered by the invasion of social media right into the decision-making nexus of that board of directors. And while I was maybe a case of huge impact, it's not dissimilar to what happens in many, many boards. So now the investor relations component, which used to be a staff function, is really being assumed a lot by the board. Chairmen of various boards meet with 4 or 5 major shareholders every quarter just to make sure they know what's on those shareholders' minds, what they worry about, what they're concerned about. So there's been an opening of boards from sort of a feudal Teutonic kind of, we are the lords of the manor, get out of our way, to a much more democratic kind of system, which is awkward and time consuming, but real.
Excellent. How involved should the chair become when the CEO leaves a company? Should the chair and board lead strategic planning and the rehiring process on behalf of staff, or create a committee to work with staff to do so?
That's on, what's the core to that question? Hiring the CEO?
Yeah, should the chair and board lead strategic planning in the rehiring process with staff on behalf of staff, or create a committee themselves to work with staff to do so?
Well, I don't know whether that's talking about strategy or CEO, but hiring a CEO is a board's sacred decision. You get that wrong, nothing works. And it's entirely a board function to do it, period, full stop, the end. You don't have to incorporate any staff views. Now, you're probably wise if you do, but it's your decision as a director and as a board to determine who the successor is going to be to the outgoing one. Strategy is entirely different. Strategy comes from management to the board for comment and discussion. Its core is in the strategy of the operators, not in the board.
What is your view of a chair's role as prime for communication with external stakeholders, including formal program of meetings with large shareholders?
Yes, sure. The share should be open to meet with the largest shareholders of the company all the time, for sure. And many of them in the Fortune 500 now do that as a matter of course. 10 years ago, it didn't happen at all. The investor relations people were there, and the investors were generally quiet unless they had a real beef. But today, most corporations' chairs and maybe the head of the governance committee, maybe head of the audit committee, maybe the head of the HR committee, visit regularly with their largest shareholders, who are typically large pension funds. Three of them, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, collectively own 30% of all the traded companies above a certain, let's say, $500 million in terms of market cap in the world. If you don't go speak to them about what you're doing and they vote against you, you're all gone. So it's in your own self-interest, let alone in looking after the people who put you there to look after their investment.
I think that wraps up our questions.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. Appreciate it. And Quinn, this is available on a recording that you will send to the people who were good enough to come tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to run through a couple commercials here with everyone on board. Really appreciate your attendance. So David runs these office hours. If you have any particularly thorny issues, you have an opportunity to reach out to him. This is available on his website. We generally run this once a quarter, and he selects a handful of people for interesting topics or areas where he could put some weight on the scales of your challenge.
In camera, like it doesn't go anywhere else, right? This is between me and the person.
Completely confidential. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Completely confidential capacity. We have a follow-up presentation on December 12th, and this is going to be a new topic. The board compass that you saw today was a repeat of a great presentation that David regularly puts on. This one coming up in December is going to be fantastic. It's how to do a board evaluation the David Beatty way. So anyone who is an active director, board chair, I highly recommend attending. Please reach out if you would like to send someone from your board. I also wanted to draw your attention. We've been running a monthly webinar series called the AI Tsunami. This is more about the hottest topic for any director to get a handle on. And the next event on October 29th is with a founder of one of Google X's ventures called Everyday Robots. He just released on September 10th an article that is 26 minutes in listening length about his mission as CEO to work for Google to give AI a robot body. Absolutely fantastic. The session that just happened today was about how to get started in a small incremental way. This one is the opposite, using the most cutting edge technology to create a moonshot. Other ways to engage with David. So we put out an excellent monthly newsletter. The one that was just in September was focused on the unique challenges of joint ventures and working between boards of directors when you're trying to install change. The next thing I would like to draw attention to, this is the most exciting one, and you are getting a small glimpse into it. We've taken David's giant archive of education data, and we've built a chatbot. We are sort of walking the talk and built this chatbot for David that anyone can pull out of their pocket and ask questions around some particular issue. There's a certain level of privacy with this information, but don't put anything out there that you wouldn't publish on Facebook. But for example, I just asked, what is the board compass? and you can actually get more particular questions. You can ask things, for example, like, I am on the board of a fintech. What should I do to run a meeting around the risk register and order to compliance requirements? Some really fantastic stuff coming out of this. We just launched it, and I'd love to share it with you in the follow-up. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we will catch you at the next events.
Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye from Germany.